Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. In November 1783, a Loyalist merchant stands on the docks of New York with a single trunk at his feet. The city behind him is quiet in a way it has never been before. British soldiers are packing their gear. Ships sit low in the water, heavy with people and possessions. When those sails rise, the empire will leave for good. The man does not know where he is going yet. He only knows where he cannot stay. His house has already been seized. His name appears on a list that marks him as an enemy of the new republic. If he remains when the last redcoats depart, there will be no court to appeal to and no authority left to protect him. Around him, thousands wait in the same silence. Former merchants who once dominated Atlantic trade sleep on wharves beside their crates. Families argue in low voices over which children will board which ship. This is not an orderly migration. It is an evacuation carried out under pressure, rumor, and fear. In the months surrounding this moment, between 80,000 and 100,000 people will abandon the former American colonies. Nearly 50,000 will be sent north to British Canada, while others scatter to Britain and the Caribbean. It will be the largest population flight in American history before the 20th century. 5 years earlier, men like Joseph Galloway believed loyalty to Britain was the safer bet. In 1783, that bet has come due. The war's over, the nation is new, and this man, like tens of thousands of others, is watching his country disappear behind him. Before the war forced choices into the open, loyalty to Britain did not look extreme or backward. It looked careful. The British Empire governed colonial life through courts, contracts, and trade networks that people relied on every day. Independence, by contrast, promised uncertainty, new governments, untested laws, and the risk that local power would outrun restraint. For Joseph Galloway, loyalty was rooted in experience rather than devotion. As one of Pennsylvania's most influential politicians before the war, he believed the colonies could be reformed without being torn from the empire that had made them prosperous. Parliamentary authority, he argued, could be limited and corrected. What could not be easily replaced was the legal order that protected property and mediated conflict across the colonies. That reasoning was shared well beyond elite circles. Small farmers worried that revolutionary politics would empower local majorities before stable institutions existed to restrain them. Merchants feared losing access to British markets and naval protection overnight. Lawyers and officials understood that independence would erase the systems that validated contracts, courts, and careers. Loyalty for many was not about monarchy, it was about continuity. Recent immigrants felt the stakes especially sharply. Scots who had arrived after the failed Jacobite rebellions carried fresh memories of what happened to those who challenged British authority and lost. They had crossed the Atlantic to escape political chaos, not to repeat it. Betting against Britain felt less like courage and more like recklessness. For enslaved Black Americans, loyalty carried a different logic entirely. British proclamations promised freedom to those who escaped rebel masters and supported the crown. It was a narrow opening and a dangerous one, but it existed. The revolutionary leadership offered no comparable path, defending slavery as property while speaking the language of liberty. Thousands calculated that loyalty to a distant empire offered a better chance at survival than loyalty to neighbors who would keep them enslaved. Many native nations reached similar conclusions. British officials, however inconsistently, had recognized treaty boundaries that limited colonial expansion. Revolutionary leaders spoke openly about Western land as the reward of independence. Supporting Britain appeared to be the only available barrier, thin and unreliable, but real, against dispossession. Early in the war, these judgments were not unreasonable. Britain remained the world's dominant imperial power, with unmatched naval strength and global resources. Independence was far from inevitable. Many expected the conflict to end in negotiation rather than separation. In that context, loyalty was not defiance, it was realism. But revolutions narrow options quickly. As the conflict hardened, hesitation began to look like betrayal. What had once been a defensible position was recast as a moral failure. Loyalty was no longer an argument to be debated. It was a liability to be eliminated. The bet that loyalty made sense was grounded in experience and probability. What it lacked was one thing no one could control: the outcome of the war. And when that outcome became clear, the cost of having chosen continuity over rupture would fall due all at once. Once the revolution turned into a war for survival, loyalty stopped being a position and became a danger. Across the colonies, revolutionary committees replaced courts and assemblies, claiming emergency authority to identify and neutralize internal threats. Allegiance was no longer assumed or debated. It was demanded through oaths, public declarations, and visible compliance. Enforcement began at the local level, where it was most effective and most personal. Neighbors reported neighbors. Old grudges were reframed as political suspicion. A man who refused to sign a loyalty oath could be fined, jailed, or publicly punished. When hot pitch was poured onto skin and feathers pressed into the burns, the violence was not symbolic. People suffered infections, shock, and lasting injury. The spectacle was meant to instruct as much as to punish. As intimidation spread, revolutionary governments formalized it. States passed confiscation acts that legalized the permanent seizure of loyalist property to fund the war. Homes, farms, shops, and tools were taken and sold quickly, often to those already aligned with the revolutionary cause. Families who had lived on the same land for generations were reduced to tenants or dependents almost overnight, with no realistic path to appeal. The pressure was relentless because it was inescapably local. Accusations came from rivals, debtors, and former friends, filtered through committees that answered to no higher authority. Silence was treated as resistance, neutrality as hostility. Even those who complied discovered that submission did not erase suspicion. It merely postponed the next demand. British occupation offered brief protection, but it sharpened the danger when control shifted. Loyalists in cities held by imperial troops could live openly and reclaim status. When Patriot forces returned, collaboration became evident. Each change of flag reopened grievances, and each transition invited retribution. The ledger never reset. From the Patriot perspective, this enforcement was justified as necessity. A revolution at war could not tolerate internal enemies, but necessity quickly blurred into punishment. The boundary between defense and revenge disappeared, replaced by a logic that allowed no dissent and little mercy. By the middle years of the conflict, the message was unmistakable. Loyalty to Britain was incompatible with public life. Those who persisted were stripped of rights, property, and protection. What had begun as a reasoned calculation had hardened into a sentence, delivered not by distant authorities, but by the people next door. By 1781, many Loyalists were still enduring punishment because they believed time remained on their side. Britain was a global empire, wars were long, and reversals were common. Defeat in one theater did not usually decide the fate of an empire. For Loyalists, patience still seemed like a rational strategy. From London, Joseph Galloway watched the war narrow. Having left America in 1778, he spent the final years of the conflict lobbying Parliament, arguing that reconciliation was still possible and that Loyalists would be essential to restoring imperial authority once order returned. His position reflected a broader Loyalist hope that endurance would be rewarded when Britain inevitably reasserted control. That hope collapsed at Yorktown. The surrender of a British army there did not end the war on paper, but it ended it politically. In Britain, public support for continuing the conflict evaporated. Parliament voted to halt offensive operations, and the government that had promised to crush the rebellion fell soon after. Britain would defend what it still held, but it would not reconquer the colonies. For Loyalists in America, the implications were immediate and devastating. The empire they had trusted was no longer advancing. It was preparing to withdraw. Protection narrowed to a handful of coastal cities, New York, Charleston, Savannah, while the countryside slipped permanently beyond reach. Loyalists living inland understood what that meant. No relief, no restoration, and no enforcement of imperial promises. The timing could not have been worse. Peace negotiations had not yet begun in earnest, and no guarantees existed for those who had supported the crown. Confiscated Loyalist property was already being sold off by the states to pay for the war. With British leverage gone, there was little reason to expect restitution. The legal machinery that excluded Loyalists now accelerated rather than slowed. For Black Loyalists, the danger sharpened immediately. British withdrawal meant the disappearance of the only authority that had recognized their freedom. Remaining in Patriot territory carried the real risk of re-enslavement, regardless of certificates or wartime assurances. What had once been a calculated gamble now became a threat to life itself. Yorktown ended denial. Loyalty no longer promised vindication. It promised exposure. Loyalists were trapped between two forces, one retreating, the other unforgiving. Waiting no longer improved their position. Each passing month narrowed their options. By the time negotiations dragged into 1782, the war was already over in the only sense that mattered to Loyalists. The empire was leaving, the revolution was consolidating, and the ground Loyalists had once stood on was disappearing beneath them. After Yorktown, delay itself became dangerous. Loyalists were no longer weighing political outcomes. They were measuring personal risk. Every path forward carried loss, but choosing nothing meant being overtaken by events they could no longer influence. To stay was to submit publicly and hope for invisibility. Loyalists who remained were required to swear allegiance to the new governments, pay taxes, and obey laws that had already stripped them of rights and property. Compliance did not bring security. Old accusations could be revived without warning, and local resentments often outlasted the war. Survival depended on silence, on never speaking of the past and never asking for what had been taken. For prominent Loyalists, staying was rarely an option. Men whose names were associated with British authority or Loyalist administration faced arrest, trial, and in some cases, execution. Their former influence had become evidence against them. Exile was not a strategic choice. It was the only remaining escape from punishment that no longer required proof. For Black Loyalists, the calculation was starker still. British authority had been the thin barrier between freedom and bondage. As imperial forces prepared to withdraw, that barrier vanished. Remaining in the United States meant exposure to slave catchers, hostile courts, and communities eager to reclaim people they still considered property. For many, staying did not mean submission. It meant re-enslavement. Families fractured under this pressure. Some members chose exile, while others stayed behind to protect what little remained. Parents left children with relatives. Spouses made different calculations based on age, health, and risk. These were not arguments about principle. They were attempts to preserve survival when no option was safe. Leaving meant surrendering land, homes, tools, and social standing built over generations. Most Loyalists could carry only what fit into a few trunks. Livestock was abandoned. Furniture and books were sold for almost nothing. Exile reduced lives to memory and necessity, stripping identity down to what could be carried across a dock. Time pressed relentlessly. Evacuation schedules were unclear, peace negotiations dragged on, and rumors filled the silence left by absent authority. Waiting too long risked being trapped once British troops departed. Leaving too early meant forfeiting any chance, however small, of restitution or protection. The revolution offered Loyalists no path back into the society taking shape around them. It offered a choice under duress: stay and disappear, or leave and lose everything familiar. Either way, the life they had known was already gone. The only question left was where the consequences would be endured. The decision to leave did not unfold as an orderly migration plan from above. It came in waves, driven by rumor, fear, and the steady retreat of British power. Loyalists moved toward the last imperial strongholds, New York, Charleston, and Savannah, hoping to secure passage before the door closed. What they found there was not safety, but congestion and desperation. New York became the center of this flight. The city swelled far beyond its capacity as refugees poured in from the countryside. Merchants who once dominated Atlantic trade slept on wharves beside their crates. Former officers stood in long lines to register their names with British officials, who could promise nothing more than a place on a list. Families waited for weeks, sometimes months, unsure whether a ship would ever come. Evacuation itself was chaotic. Ships were overcrowded, supplies thin, and schedules unreliable. People boarded vessels without knowing their destination, sometimes learning where they were headed only after leaving harbor. In the confusion, families were separated, possessions lost, and records misplaced. The empire was moving people faster than it could organize their future. By the end of 1783, between 80,000 and 100,000 people had fled the former colonies. Nearly half, around 46,000 to 50,000, were sent north to British North America, while others were scattered across the Atlantic world. Roughly 7,000 to 10,000 went directly to Britain, and more than 20,000 were carried to the Caribbean, often with little understanding of what awaited them there. Social hierarchies collapsed in plain view. Wealth and status no longer guaranteed comfort or priority. Men who had once commanded others slept beside laborers and servants, all competing for the same limited passage. Disease spread quickly in crowded quarters, and tempers flared as uncertainty replaced order. This was not resettlement, it was escape. British officials attempted to impose structure, but their resources were finite. Military needs competed with civilian evacuation, and imperial attention drifted elsewhere. Some loyalists waited until the final weeks of occupation, watching ships depart amid confusion rather than planning. When the last British troops evacuated New York in November 1783, the flight ended abruptly. Entire communities had vanished from the map of the new United States. What remained behind was silence, empty houses, transferred deeds, and a population that no longer belonged. For those who left, the crossing offered no sense of arrival. The ships carried them away from danger, but not toward certainty. Exile solved the immediate threat, yet delivered them into a future that had not been prepared for their survival. On maps and in proclamations, British North America looked like salvation. Vast land, imperial protection, and distance from revolutionary anger suggested a place where loyalists could begin again. In practice, Canada was not prepared to receive them. It was a frontier already stretched thin, suddenly tasked with absorbing tens of thousands of displaced people. When Loyalists arrived, they encountered scarcity first. Settlements were small, supply lines fragile, and administration minimal. Much of the existing population was French-speaking and governed under legal traditions unfamiliar to English-speaking newcomers. Land was available in theory, but often unsurveyed, inaccessible, or unsuitable for immediate farming. Promises made in London dissolved against the realities of weather, distance, and delay. The first winters defined the experience. Many Loyalists arrived too late to plant crops and survived on irregular rations distributed by overburdened officials. Families lived in tents or crude shelters, exposed to cold and disease. Hunger was common. Illness spread through overcrowded camps. In some settlements, newcomers outnumbered the existing population 2 or 3 to 1, overwhelming food supplies and local authority within months. The burden fell unevenly. Black Loyalists were typically assigned the poorest land, far from ports and markets, with fewer tools and less support. Promised provisions arrived late or not at all. Legal freedom did not translate into protection or opportunity. Distance from slavery was real, but so were isolation and discrimination that made daily survival uncertain. White Loyalists fared better, but not well. Land grants were smaller and less fertile than advertised. Compensation payments, when they arrived, covered only a fraction of what had been lost. Skills suited to colonial towns, law, trade, administration, proved of limited use in frontier conditions. Social status did not travel easily across borders. Despite this, Loyalists rebuilt where they could. They cleared land, founded towns, and recreated familiar institutions, churches, courts, and local councils shaped by British norms. Their presence reshaped the region's demography and politics, forcing imperial authorities to respond. New provinces were created not as rewards for loyalty, but as mechanisms to manage a refugee population that could not be ignored. Over time, stability emerged for some. Communities took root, trade resumed, and order returned in fragments. But restoration never did. Canada offered safety, not vindication. It was a place to endure, not a place to reclaim what had been taken. For many Loyalists, the realization was painful and unavoidable. Exile had spared them immediate danger, but it had not delivered the future they were promised. Loyalty determined where they landed. It did not determine how they lived once they arrived. For Black Loyalists, exile did not bring resolution. It exposed the limits of every promise that had drawn them to the British side in the first place. During the war, British proclamations had offered freedom to enslaved people who escaped rebel masters and supported the crown. Thousands took the risk. They fled plantations under threat of capture or death, reached British lines, and had their names recorded by officers who issued certificates recognizing their freedom. For many, these documents were the only barrier standing between liberty and chains. When evacuation began, that distinction mattered. Briefly. Roughly 3,000 to 3,500 Black Loyalists were officially recorded in the Book of Negroes and transported from New York to Nova Scotia as free people. Their names, ages, and former owners were carefully written down, a rare acknowledgement that freedom had been promised and, at least on paper, honored. But this was only part of the story. While a few thousand sailed north toward uncertain freedom, more than 15,000 other Black people were taken south to the Caribbean by fleeing white loyalists. They were not listed as refugees. They were carried as property, forced onto ships bound for Jamaica and the Bahamas, trading one plantation for another as slavery was reestablished elsewhere in the empire. For those who reached Canada, freedom proved fragile. Black Loyalists were settled on marginal land, often far from towns and markets, with fewer tools and less support than their white counterparts. Promised rations arrived late or not at all. Wages went unpaid. Courts recognized their legal status slowly and defended it unevenly. Freedom existed in law, but daily life was shaped by exclusion and insecurity. Discrimination was open and persistent. Black Loyalists were barred from skilled trades, pushed to the edges of settlements, and subjected to violence with little protection. Some former enslavers attempted to reclaim them, exploiting confusion and distance to challenge their freedom. The empire that had recorded their names struggled to defend them once peace returned. Out of this failure came a second displacement. Black Loyalist communities petitioned British authorities, documenting broken promises and unequal treatment. The response was not reform, but relocation. In the late 1780s, Britain supported the resettlement of several thousand Black Loyalists to West Africa, where a new colony, later known as Sierra Leone, was presented as a place where freedom might finally be secure. The journey across the Atlantic repeated familiar dangers: disease, hunger, and uncertainty. Sierra Leone was not a reward for loyalty. It was an escape from disappointment layered atop betrayal. Britain had used freedom as a wartime incentive, but it lacked the will to guarantee that freedom in peace. The fate of Black Loyalists reveals the narrow truth behind imperial loyalty. Some were granted freedom and then abandoned to hardship. Others were never freed at all. Their loyalty was acknowledged when it was useful and set aside when it became inconvenient. While evacuation ships crowded the harbors, most Loyalists never boarded them. They remained in the United States not because the new republic welcomed them back, but because leaving was impossible, impractical, or too dangerous. For these men and women, survival required a different strategy, one built not on movement, but on disappearance. After independence, American governments offered no real path to restoration. Confiscated property was rarely returned, even when peace treaties recommended it. Political disabilities lingered, and local hostility did not fade with the end of fighting. Former Loyalists quickly learned that pressing old claims invited renewed scrutiny. Silence proved safer than justice. Public conformity became essential. Loyalists who stayed swore allegiance to the new republic, paid taxes, and withdrew from political life. Participation was tolerated only if it left no trace. Any attempt to reclaim influence or public standing risked reopening accusations that still carried social and legal consequences. This erasure extended into family life. Parents avoided speaking about the war, especially to children growing up in schools and churches that celebrated independence as a shared moral triumph. The national story allowed no space for hesitation or dissent. To remember differently was to mark oneself as suspect. Over time, Loyalist identity became unusable. It could not be defended publicly and could not be passed down without stigma. What survived did so quietly, buried in private letters, property records, and legal documents stripped of political meaning. Memory fragmented, then faded. This disappearance was not accidental. The new nation required a clean origin story, one built on unity, sacrifice, and legitimacy. Loyalists complicated that story by revealing how contested independence had been. Rather than confront that reality, American society absorbed them by denying them a distinct past. Within a generation, Loyalism no longer existed as a public identity in the United States. Its adherents had not been expelled or executed en masse. They had been neutralized by conformity and time. To remain was to accept that the revolution would move forward without acknowledging them. By the early 19th century, the question of British Loyalists no longer demanded an answer. It had already been settled. not through reconciliation or justice, but through outcomes that required no announcement. Loyalists had disappeared from public life because they no longer fit the story the new nation told about itself. Those who left were scattered across the British Empire. In British North America, they became foundational populations in new colonies shaped by caution, hierarchy, and continuity rather than revolutionary rupture. Their influence survived in institutions, borders, and political culture, even as their losses were never restored. In West Africa, Black Loyalists built fragile communities after being betrayed twice, first by the American Republic, then by the empire that had promised protection. In the Caribbean, others reconstructed versions of their former lives under harsher systems, carrying slavery with them as the price of economic recovery. Those who stayed followed a quieter path. They did not reemerge as a loyal opposition or a recognized minority. They survived by becoming indistinguishable. Wartime choices were folded into silence, and identities dissolved into a national narrative that left no room for doubt at its origin. Within a generation, their children were simply Americans, inheriting a history that omitted the calculations and fears that had once shaped their families. What unites these outcomes is not punishment alone, but exclusion through movement and memory. The revolution did not defeat loyalists in battle and then forgive them in peace. It moved forward without them. Britain acknowledged obligation, but offered relocation instead of restoration. The United States consolidated legitimacy by forgetting those who had questioned its birth. Loyalists were not wrong in their reasoning. Many of their fears proved accurate. Independence did bring instability, violence, and exclusion before it brought order. But history does not reward accuracy. It rewards alignment with victory. Loyalty to the losing side, however rational, became a liability that time quietly erased. In the end, what happened to British Loyalists after the Revolution was not decided by a single law, treaty, or purge. It was decided by who was allowed to belong when the war was over, and who was not. They were scattered, absorbed, or transformed elsewhere until their absence itself became the answer.